After assisting an elderly male who was wet from the rain to wait out at a restaurant, a poor waitress who lost her only source of income received a touching surprise that repaid her kindness hundredfold. As she was busy serving customers, she heard a slow tapping followed by pattering on the big windows. When an older man entered the restaurant drenched to the skin, the patrons outside fled for cover as the black cloud spat beads of rain. He was so wet that Aria started to get concerned for him. She motioned for the 70-year-old Franklin to take a seat by the window and said, "Sir, this way, please." Even though Aria went above and beyond, the other diners complained when they saw Franklin enter. They believed him to be a wandering beggar. As Franklin entered, Aria noticed how the customers scowled and covered their noses. She gently instructed him to enter the kitchen through the back door after feeling sorry for him and instantly stopping. "Sir, the floor just got mopped. Would you mind entering by the other door in the kitchen that we have?" "Yes, absolutely." Miss Aria handed Franklin a towel as soon as he entered the kitchen so he could dry off. She then presented him with a bowl of hot soup and an old blanket to keep him warm. Franklin said, wheezing, "Thank you so much, miss. I'm happy to help. Sir, would you like anything else?" "Hi, no thank you, miss. The rain must have ceased. I'm behind schedule. I want to thank you again." Never look down on someone or make snap judgment about them because you can be fooled by your own eyes. Franklin left the kitchen as Aria's employer stormed in furiously. A visitor had protested that she had admitted a wayfarer. When the boss saw what had happened, he yelled at Aria for bringing the elderly guy into the kitchen. He yelled, "How dare you bring a beggar into the kitchen?" As the elder employees crowded around him and looked at Aria, "I'm sorry, sir, but the poor fellow was soaked and defenseless. Do you believe that this is a sanctuary for begging?" Aria remained motionless, and still what's worse is that no one offered to support her. "You're out. Get out my restaurant right away." "Please, sir, don't do this. I have to have a job. I need to get medications because my mom is ill at home. You need to have it given in some thought before you let that wanderer inside. Don't come back. Leave immediate." Aria was so humiliated that she had to leave the restaurant in a heartbroken state. Nobody thanked her for being so kind, which made her feel even worse. Franklin abruptly stopped her as she was leaving the restaurant while sobbing. "I heard everything, miss, but resist feeling depressed. This may have occurred for a purpose." Franklin comforted Aria and offered her an incredible reward for her generosity. After reflecting for a week, Aria decided to concur because she needed money to care for her mother. She was left with no other option. Franklin was well cared after by Aria after she moved in with him. Happiness returned to Aria's life after a period of time. She wasn't required to work as long hours as hard as she did in the restaurant. Franklin never thought of her as his caregiver. Instead, he treated her like his own. All of Aria's happiness soon came to an abrupt halt when she discovered Franklin dead in his bed. He had died peacefully while resting. "What will I do now? You treated me as though I were your daughter without you." "What will I do at Franklin's burial?" Aria sobbed. Only as buddies and business associates were present. Aria managed things as if she were the late Franklin's daughter, since she had no. The phone rang as Aria was preparing to leave the mansion after Franklin was laid to rest. Aria had no idea how this phone call would alter her life. "Miss Ludwig is the shoe." Yes, sure." "Who is this?" "Miss Ludwig." "Good morning, Charles. Here, Mr. Brown's attorney. It's crucial that you visit my office. Therefore, please keep my address in mind." Later that day, I encountered the attorney who had previously read Franklin's will, when she realized she was the only heir to her late master's land. She was rendered speech. Up until his last cent, Franklin had left Area his whole estate. As the attorney handed Area Franklin's final letters, tears of delight and thankfulness streamed down her face. "Dear, I felt alone and without a reason to live beside a mess in cash. But once you arrived, I never again felt alone, and you spoke to me as if I were your father. You provided me with the family I was missing. I wish you both a long and happy." Former waitress Area, who had been sacked from her position for showing kindness, was now the director of a posh 5-star hotel in the area. Even with her newly acquired wealth, Area was always gracious to others. If you like this story, then you'll like this next one. It's about a poor, elderly woman who was blessed to find a bag of groceries at her doorstep one day. From an anonymous source of kindness, it'll steal your heart. Mrs. Gibbs was through the most difficult week of her life when a sympathetic acquaintance noticed and elated her concerns. The elderly woman with untidy hair and a torn shawl began to draw the store manager's interest any given day. He would have missed her making the third circuit of the shop, where she would take items from the shelves, inspect them, and then put them back. But because it was a slow day of the week, the shop manager saw Mrs. Gibbs' face repeatedly from the start of a shift into lunch. Mrs. Gibbs was actually having one of those days where she couldn't find something for that night's dinner that she could afford. Normally, she was able to purchase some potatoes, fruits, or at the very least, a loaf of the cheapest bread. However, it was an especially challenging day. In the final week of the month, Mrs. Gibbs had been searching every neighborhood grocery store for something she could buy with spare change. "I could have saved on the repairs and enjoyed a big supper tonight if it weren't for the broken pipe that nearly flooded the kitchen." She reasoned her small pension had been depleted by the third month in a row, forcing her to scrounge for scraps for a full week. "Ma'am, is there anything I can do to assist you?" he inquired to Mrs. Gibbs. She was abruptly brought back to the present day by the inquiry. She couldn't recall when she had sat down on the stool in the gourmet area because she was so deep in concentration. "That's it, son. Just browsing." "Really?" Mrs. Gibbs grabbed onto the folded grocery bag as she observed the store manager's gaze, displaying a hint of skepticism. She made her way as quickly as she could out the store. The sun above her wouldn't make the long trek home any easier. She limped along the pavement, being careful not to let the right shoe's dangling sole fully fall. Along the route, there were cafes and juice bars. She reasoned that at least one of them would be delighted to assist her with a sandwich and a bottle of water. But she resisted the tiniest urge to enter the stores. Mrs. Gibbs' Achilles' heel was that she could never bring herself to ask for the assistance she required 30 minutes of ignoring her hunger PS, and stifling or thirst-later Mrs. Gibbs could finally make out of her house at the end of it. It was a small house with outdated blue and white paint and a failing roof that would cost her a lot the following month. By this time, Fido, the neighbor's dog, would typically run over to her, but he wasn't there that day. Instead, she witnessed a startling sight. The neighbor, who was also the owner of Fido, was secretly leaving Mrs. Gibbs's home and heading for his. Hey, Mrs. Gibbs sprinted in his direction. She was about to continue when the sole of her shoe suddenly detached. Was that Charlie too? He wasn't supposed to be on my porch, was he stealing? Diana didn't want to accept it, since she thought Charles was a decent person. When he returned to his hometown, he struggled to find a stable employment to support his wife, who was expecting, and his 3 kids. And he was never close to Mrs. Gibbs, but always sweet to her. It didn't really hit her until Charlie had more than enough justification to turn to theft for all those reasons. When Mrs. Gibbs eventually arrived at her door, she understood how mistaken she had been. The elderly woman discovered a package of canned goods, a bag of misshaped veggies, buns wrapped in newspaper, and 3 bottles of various fruit liquids. The food was piled neatly at her doorstep, which relieved her but overwhelmed her. This should easily last her a week, she reasoned Charlie. "Charlie, I know you can hear me. Get out here in an effort to see through the large shrubs that served as a fence between the houses." Mrs. Gibbs shouted out, or I'll call Gloria on the phone. Mrs. Gibbs made an agitated and irritated noise. Charlie approached his neighbor without making eye contact. Perhaps I did step over a line. So what if I saw Mrs. Gibbs fumbling around the grocery store looking for something? She had no idea that I currently work there. Knowing her, she'd be embarrassed that I noticed her in trouble. "Mrs. Gibbs, how are you doing today?" Charlie asked, and then quickly regretted his pointless inquiry. "How come you did this?" Mrs. Gibbs pointed at the pile of food at her door and got right to the point. Charlie paused for a second to collect his thoughts at the grocery store. "I saw you. You were too arrogant. I knew to beg for assistance, and I believed the only way I could assist you was by making an anonymous don. Don't you think you could have done a better job with the anonymous part?" He was questioned in a very different, jocular manner by Mrs. Gibbs. The abrupt change in her neighbor's speech startled Charlie at first, but he soon joined in with a chuckle. Charlie was assisting a customer at the grocery store the next day when he was abruptly summoned to a meeting with the business manager. As he made his way to the manager's office, he experienced a pit in his. "I simply can't afford to lose my job as well." He was surprised to find the store manager joking with an elderly customer. Undoubtedly, it was Mrs. Gibbs. "Mrs. Gibbs informed me that yesterday you stole expired and rejected fruit from the store." The store owner had stopped giggling. "Sorry, but that's true. I did deliver several empty juice and bean cans to her." I believe she was having trouble and needed the assistance, the manager stated in a severe voice. "Well, you should have thought about the fact that your actions will have wider implications. Now, 2 things are about to occur as a result of your actions." Charlie was resisting the urge to leave that very moment and never look back. He had to decide what to say to his wife where he was going to look for a new job. Charlie was given an envelope by the boss who said, "First, you will take this and follow me before you read it." "You as well, sir." The group headed over to the bakery area when his manager coughed loudly. It startled Charlie out of his reverie and brought him back to the present. He then noticed it. A big cabinet filled with bread, vegetables, fruits, cereals, and other items was located next to the bread section. The notice on the cabinet, "Read donation shelf, choose anything for nothing." The new effort excited Charlie, and he was taken aback to see his boss grinning once. He was now confused about what was in the envelope. The manager read what it was, and it said, "I am elevating you to assistant store manager because you have demonstrated a degree of consideration and initiative that is ideal for a leader. You will therefore receive a desk and higher compensation." "Young man, aren't you forgetting something?" The manager was being pushed by Mrs. Gibbs. "Oh, absolutely. You can now move in with your wife, and you can thank Mrs. Gibbs for yelling at me until I acquiesced." Charlie was too ecstatic to recall. Mrs. Gibbs disliked embraces before sobbing with happiness. He managed to whisper thank you as he hugged her.